Well, we're all hearing about AI because it's on the news every day. Big predictions about how lots of people are going to be employed. It's going to be worth 16 trillion by 2030. Uh, we've got $300 billion valuation for OpenAI. We have almost $10 trillion in increase in market capitalization over the last 2.5 years for the Magnificent Seven. These are big numbers. Why don't I believe them? Well, you put money in, you get money out. So you look at, well, what's coming out? What's the money that's coming out? And we'll talk later about some other things that aren't coming out, but let's talk money because this is what a bubble is about. A bubble is about too high of valuations, too high of stock prices. It's not, when I say there's an AI bubble, I'm not saying AI is bad. Not at all. There's lots of great applications, and many of you listeners have used AI and really like it. Hey, that's fine. I believe, but there isn't a lot of revenues. I mean, if you look at the revenues for AI, you're talking about 35 billion maybe. You've got about 5 billion last year, and I'm talking about last year's numbers, 5 billion, less than 5 billion for the AI software companies such as OpenAI. Then you've got maybe 25 billion for cloud services such as those from Google and Microsoft. And you say, well, those numbers, that's great. That's great. Well, it's nothing close to the 16 trillion that was predicted for 2030. Not only that, but these cloud companies are spending $170 billion a year investing in the AI, and they're only getting $25 billion out. Whoa, wait. See, there's a problem here. Now, in addition, a lot of you will be thinking, well, there's this applications, so many applications. Well, there may be. And, I don't go down that route because I don't assume that I know what everybody needs. So whether I like it or not really doesn't mean much because I'm not representative of all users, and none of you are. But you know what? Where people spend money tells you a lot about whether they like the application or not. You don't want to talk about users because users, yeah, that works when it's really cheap and you can offer a Google search for free and social media for free, and then you can pay with ads. But AI search and AI applications, they're not cheap. You got to get revenues. You've got to find the people who have a willingness to pay. And we're not finding those people. So this is a big reason why I'm pessimistic. It's not because they used AI and they said, oh, it's terrible. No, it's because there isn't a lot of people spending money on AI. A lot of final users.
Today's guest, of course, is Dr. Jeffrey Funk. We're discussing his latest book, which is called Unicorns, Hype, and Bubbles, a guide to spotting, avoiding, and exploiting investment bubbles in tech. I always hear about how people think this era is so advanced. And it was like, if you went into a coma, say in, 1995, and you came out of a coma in 2025, so 30 years, I feel like you'd be vastly disappointed. We already had the first smartphone in 94, which was the IBM Simon, which even had a touch screen and a calendar in 94. Of course, we had the internet. That was the early days of Amazon and all this stuff. Like, I don't really think a whole lot has changed. I think when people want to talk about these changes, they're kind of talking about like, we live in a digital era, but in terms of the actual physical real world, not a whole lot's changed. We're still using the same toilet, the same plumbing. We're living in the same 1960s house. The average car in the U.S. is almost 13 years old. Like, how many people are driving this brand new Tesla or EV? Not many people. Like, what is it, like something like 1% of all cars on the road? People want to talk about Uber Eats and this stuff. I mean, most people can't afford it. You have more people probably as an Uber Eats driver than actually the one receiving the Uber Eats. I just think and then you tell people this and they think you're crazy. Like, oh no, it's so technologically advanced. And they say that because the media tells them that. They're just parroting what they hear. Like, if you actually look around, how is it any different? Go to a grocery store. You're still checking out the same way. A lot of stores are getting rid of self-checkouts because they're getting food stolen. We don't live in a technologically advanced era. Am I wrong?
No, you're making some very good points that I've made often too, and points that others have made. So like Robert Gordon He's making his points in I forget the title of his book, 2016, but it said a lot of these things, and it reminds people, maybe it tells people for the first time, that there was much, much faster growth in the late 1800s. Think about one of those Westerns you watch, right? It's usually set in about 1880. They'll never tell you, but it's about 1880. Uh, in about 30 years, and what started in the 1880s was uh, telephones, electricity, running water. By 1900, you had automobiles, you had mass transport, you had recorded music. This was the time of vastly different changes. So by 1920, even those rural people were getting these things. These were big changes, right? And just look closely at those westerns. You'll see how simple their life was, right? And so our era can't compare to that. And of course, Robert Gordon, that's his point, that there's been a big slowdown and that things we don't live in this era of big change because most things aren't changing. The biggest change, of course, is people looking at their phones, which in a lot of ways isn't a good thing. Get out there and walk around in the hills. So so I agree with you.
Yeah, you're talking about Robert Gordon. I've read his book, The Rise and Fall of American Growth. And I was
Yes,
actually,
thank you.
in preparation for this podcast, I was talking to my fiance about it. I've read that book a while back, but basically he's like, what would you rather live without? The internet or indoor plumbing? Would you rather live we're in Puerto Rico. Would you rather live without the internet or air conditioning? I mean, like it's the inventions that they had, 100 or we had, I should say, 100 years ago, were literally life changing. And kind of as you say in the book, like we do have inventions, but there's a big difference between I'm hammered at a bar. Instead of taking a taxi, I'll just use my cell phone and order up an Uber. Like maybe it's a little bit more convenient than standing out on a curb on a rainy Friday or something, but it's not really the difference between electricity and dialing up something for convenience.
Yeah. Well, I agree with you. Yeah, it doesn't compare to that, but the tech sector, the tech bros, they've convinced us otherwise, and they have a reason to convince us otherwise because they want our money. Because the way they make money is very different from the startups 50 years ago. 50 years ago, the startups were very careful. They do a lot of experimentation. They try to find a good market, a good product. They try to have good product market fit. Then they get profitable. Then they go public, do an IPO. And people say, oh, that's a good company. Yeah, I like their products. They're making money. And then the people start to get rich. And that happened very fast. So if you look at the profitability of startups 40, 50 years ago, it was very quickly. It was all mostly within 10 years, a lot of times 5 years. So I document this in my book and lots of papers. But that's different now. Now, the point is not to get profitable and offer a good product. It's to convince everything that your product is someday going to be so great that it will just change the world. And of course, the simple example is Sam Altman at OpenAI. It's in its 10th year, maybe 11th year now. That Amazon became profitable in its 10th year. OpenAI is nowhere near becoming profitable, right? And yet, how does he keep a stock price? Well, he convinces people that by inviting Johnny Ives to design his device, that somehow this device can be so great and OpenAI's products and services are going to be so great that, wow, that his $300 billion valuation is justified. So that's the current way. And there's tons of companies that do this, people that constantly have a big story they're going to tell. And Sam Altman recently said, I want to stop talking about AGI when that's going to come. Let's talk about self-replicating spaceships. How many people laughed at him? 40 years ago, we would have all laughed and said, oh, who is this guy? We shouldn't be listening to this guy. He's up on Capitol Hill. He's testifying to Congress about AI. People take him seriously. Well, how can you take somebody like that seriously?
Jeff, I mean, basically, like, everything you're talking about is interesting because you actually have like real world experience. I mean, you're what, like, are you in your 70s now, or late 60s, early 70s? Is that
Yeah, I'm 69. Yeah.
right? 69. So, pushing 70. I mean, you graduated with a PhD from a pretty legit school in Carnegie Mellon in 1984. You also worked at like semiconductor factories. You were a professor of these technology courses and the U.S., Singapore, Japan. I mean, like, you've taught as a professor as well as actually worked in these careers and in these fields. So you actually have an idea what you're talking about, and I've seen like a pretty big spectrum to think. Like the internet wasn't even publicly available when you first started to now, with apps on a smartphone.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I was 13 when we landed on the moon, and I was really impressed. I thought we'd be going to the moon a lot by 2000. I mean, this was a big deal to me. And, you know, 1969, in the early 70s, all the Star Trek, then Star Wars. And I studied physics at in undergrad. I just thought that this was all these things were going to happen. You know, we're going to have we not only going to space, we're going to have superconductivity, we're going to have nanotechnology. I didn't know it then, but I certainly believed that all these things were going to happen. And it took a while. It took me really until 2010s before I turned a pessimist. The other thing I did was in the late 1990s, I was in Japan for the mobile internet. This is another thing that made me very optimistic. Japan was the first country to be successful in mobile internet, but I could see that this was going to come to America. Moore's law, making these devices better, these phones cheaper and better. I could see all this happening. So I was an optimist when I moved to Singapore in 2007 and started teaching this course in the economics of new technologies. Uh, but then by the early 2010s, I realized that a lot of these technologies weren't getting better as faster as I thought they would. Things like carbon nanotubes and ultra thin graphene and superconductors and bioelectronics, the Thronos kind. So I basically started becoming a pessimist. And now, as you can tell, I'm very pessimistic.
Jeff, since we're discussing your book, Unicorns, Hype, and Bubbles, as kind of from an investor standpoint, I thought this is a quote from your book I found interesting. You say that it took 10 years for Silicon Valley to recover from the dot-com bubble. It will take longer to recover from this one. And just for a little bit of context, Microsoft, which was one of the biggest companies before the dot-com crash, it took 17 years for Microsoft to actually fully recover to the stock price of $58.38, which is basically 1999 to 2016. So, I mean, how big of a bubble are we in now? And when do you think this bubble will burst? And how long will it take it to recover? If you're saying it's going to take longer than the dot-com bubble.
Well, as I said earlier, think about revenues. Think about how much revenues you're getting from AI versus the investment. So I mentioned, maybe $35 billion in software and cloud service AI revenues versus the $170 billion that's expected to be invested this year by the biggest cloud service companies. At 2000, I think 2000 was the peak of the internet. In 2000, there was a lot more revenues, particularly if you adjust it for 2024 dollars. Because, people, if you wanted the internet, you had to pay for it. You had to pay for a PC and an internet subscription. And then people were spending a lot of money on e-commerce. And travel was already big back then. So you look at those figures, you put those three together, and you get about $1.5 trillion in revenues. Well, that's not profit. So really, in a bubble, companies are looking at profits. That's what they want. They're expecting profit. So that's what they're expecting. But profits take a long time to emerge. Number one, number two, companies don't release that kind of information on per sector. So if we just look at revenues, we were getting 1.5 trillion in 2020 for the internet, and we're getting 35 billion for AI now. That's a big imbalance. A very big imbalance. And that's going to have an impact because at some point, investors are going to say, wait a minute, wait a minute, wait a minute. When we're putting too much money into this AI stuff, uh, and so the share prices are going to go down. Um, so yeah, I think it's going to be a big pop when it happens.
One of the big themes of the book is like basically like ultimately how do you measure the success of one of these startups? And it's like, a lot of the inputs are probably not like good measures. And I thought one of the big themes is just like, is your life better? I mean, like that's ultimately like what these technologies, what these advancements, what, progress is about. And you figure, oh, the medical is so advanced these days. Okay, why are people living why did people live longer in 2014 than they do now? So like, and that's way before the pandemic. You can't be like, well, the pandemic was the reason. No, this is 5 years before the pandemic. Commute times, again, like we're spending 10 more minutes a day in an average commute. So I thought that we had all these robo taxis and self-driving cars. Food. Everyone says we have obesity and everyone's eating processed foods, and the foods that we do have, like the actual produce has less, minerals and less vitamins per, kind of per piece of produce. What about mental health? Well, what are all the problems that social media is causing? Now we have mental health issues, right? So like, and then of course, like housing, like people can't even afford houses anymore. If you factor in the real cost of a house adjusted for inflation is like half as much 30 years ago. So, I mean, so if you just kind of look at like, a metric you're talking about, like if your life is better today, or is it better 30 years ago, where is the progress that everyone's talking about?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. You cited a very long list of very good metrics. And so a lot of times people just look at per capita income, and I make that error too, and productivity figures and stuff. But you're right. Ultimately, it's supposed to make our lives better. And let's face it, this is what people in America are mad about. People on the left are all mad that Donald Trump got elected, but what they're ignoring is that there was people mad about Joe Biden and Obama, and there's a lot of anger in America, and that's really the question. It isn't that, oh, we hate Trump. We have to understand, where did these terrible candidates come from, and where did all the anger at the candidates come from? It comes from the things you're mentioning, things that haven't gotten better. They should, right? They should. Why shouldn't they? We have new technology, maybe not as much as we used to have, but still we have some new things. We should be making things better, but we're not. And so all the things you're mentioning, there are reasons why people are angry. And of course, America isn't the only place where this anger is being felt, but it certainly is the biggest place. It certainly is the biggest anger that has emerged, and the world is better in America.
So, Jeff, in your book, you certainly cover a lot of different technologies. So, you talk about smart everything, VR, AR, wearables, satellite internet, blockchain, delivery drones, space tourism, hyperloop, quantum computing, nuclear fusion, synthetic biology, and you also talk about smartwatches. And I basically found it interesting that of all those, you basically say like the only technology maybe that will kind of keep pace with the actual hype around it was a smartwatch, which to me seems pretty dire when instead of like looking at your phone, you look at your smartwatch, maybe combined with a Fitbit, and this is like the breakthrough. I mean, like, give me a break. This is what we're talking about, Jeff. 2025, a smartwatch is the best we can do.
Well, smartwatches, there are a lot of devoted users of smartwatches. They use it to monitor their heart rates. They use it to count how many steps they take. And to Apple's credit, it's not really been hyping it. It's not really been making real big promises like other companies do. But other people have made big promises about wearables. I mean, I can remember in the mid 2000s, people talking about how they were going to monitor all of our health because, think of all the, uh, drops from your eyes, blood, mucus, all the things that come out of your body. If you can monitor them, you can find potential problems. You can identify cancer early. Now, of course, all that assumes that it's not just the device, it's being able to find a good biomarker for cancer. Very, 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 very hard. So none of that's happened, but those were the promises. And I remember because, I taught this course on economics of new technologies. Maybe I didn't mention that that's when I began to become pessimistic. So I was teaching this course, covering all these technologies, talking about these things. And I began to realize that improvements in them weren't happening as fast as they initially had. Initially, I noticed in the late 2000s, uh, things weren't happening. So yeah, smartwatch certainly is a bigger success story than many other technologies that also throw in the satellite internet, Starlink. Uh, but the wearables have not even come close to the hype that many people were putting out there, 10 years ago.
What's kind of like the next 5 or 10 years looking like? I think the one area that people have really kind of jumped on, of course, is generative AI with ChatGPT. I live in a college town. I talk to a lot of college students when I'm out, and I mean, they all basically use it to do homework. I talk to others that don't want to use it to do homework, but they're like, well, the other students are using it to do homework, so like you're going to have to. It's kind of like, the whole like performance enhancing drugs and in baseball or football or something, where you got to do it to keep up with the Joneses, so to speak. But you had Sam Altman, I think in 2017, basically write a essay saying that 90% of all jobs were going to be gone because of AI, and they're going to be giving people a $13,500 a month or a year UBI, which doesn't sound like a lot of money, but in reality it is, because the cost of labor is going to be zero. Which is just ridiculous, right? But the fact is, like, I mean, I think most people can, ChatGPT AI will augment their job. I don't think people will deny that, but like, you're not having a robot plumber come to your house tomorrow. So kind of what do you kind of foresee the next 5 years? I mean, let's not do 10 years, might be too far. Let's do 5 years out.
Well, there are certainly a lot of companies making big claims about, 50% of our software is written by AI, and Klarna said that we're going to eliminate all these call center workers, and then other companies have made similar claims, but they never produce details. Until when they do, they end up retracting things. So Klarna, Starbucks, IBM have all retracted a lot of their claims this year. And if you look at software coding, yeah, it's useful, but when you look at, there was a good IEEE article written by some people at AMD, which we know is a chip maker, but also writes the software that links those chips with devices. They know a lot about software, and they find, well, it helps, but not really. It helps a little, right? So that's the problem, is that these things help, and that's why I said initially on here is that I'm not saying it's bad. I'm saying that it's just overhyped. But it's not helping as much as people thought. And it's difficult because reducing the hallucinations is a big deal. And if you're doing a complex system, you can't have mistakes in your code. And then how are you going to find them? How are you going to debug them? The coders spend very little time writing code. It's mostly about planning and debugging. And so you need a system that's going to help them do that. And it's not really, it's helping them write first drafts. And yeah, if you have a good coder, no, actually, the AMD found that it helped the bad coders more than the good coders, because the bad coders didn't know how to solve the problems. But in any case, the point is that these things are going to take a lot longer. It will slowly happen, but it's not happening that quickly. And if it slowly happens, that means that the revenues aren't going to rise very fast. And you mentioned students. So students may keep using it because you're right. They don't care that they don't learn anything. That's not their concern. And unfortunately, educational institutions are managed so poorly that all they can do is try to grade your exam and give you a grade, and they think that, oh, I give them a grade, he or she must be really smart, when they weren't, because they use Chat GTP. So they may continue doing this, but the generative AI companies, of course, have to decide if they want to start making money, right? So they're losing money on all these users. To make money, they're eventually going to have to charge people, and people tend to be, they don't want to pay for these types of things. It's like news. How many people pay for news? I pay for a lot of news, but I know a lot of young people will never pay for news, even though, how are you going to learn unless you're getting good news? Well, it's tough. And so I think the AI companies are going to raise their prices at some point, and that will reduce that kind of usage. So it's a long, slow road. And then there's the bubble popping. So bubble popping is going to reduce the amount of money that goes into AI. And it will reduce not only good money for for bad applications, but for good applications, because that's the way it works. You see, on the way up, as the bubble is inflating, all those share prices are going up, money is just flowing everywhere for good and bad applications. It's irrational, right? This was the point of Robert Shiller, Nobel laureate, who won his Nobel Prize for analyzing bubbles. He wrote a book 25 years ago called Irrational Exuberance. This is what happens on the way up. The money is not very logical, it just kind of flows everywhere. Well, what's going to happen when the bubble pops? Well, there'll be a lot of illogic. So a lot of good applications are going to lose money in addition to bad applications. So this is going to impact a lot of people's lives, right? There's going to be a slowdown in investment, and there'll be a slowdown in usage. So yeah, the usage will slowly rise, but I don't think that it's going to be as fast as we saw the internet after the internet bubble popped, right? After the internet bubble popped, the internet just kept growing. Well, because the internet had a lot of revenues. AI doesn't have revenues. The only way to get revenues is you raise prices. You raise prices, and that reduces people's incentive to use it.
In the book, you say that 90% of today's unicorn startups are still unprofitable, despite being founded at least 10 years ago. When does this stuff come to collapse then? I mean, if you're talking, all this money, like there's no profits, 90% of unicorns are unprofitable. I mean, this stuff has to collapse soon, right?
Well, the funny thing is that the whole startup bubble had popped by the time I was really proposing this book and completing this book in 2023. It was that, and I had a chapter called "The Big Startup Bubble," the Great Startup Bubble. I forget the exact word, but and of course, what happened is that it took a long time. A publisher wanted to wait. It agreed to having the book, agreed to publish the book in late 2023, but it didn't want to publish till late 2024 in October. Even though I really had the book done. So then, I kept updating it. And what changed, of course, was that great startup bubble I ran wasn't so great anymore, because there was this great generative AI bubble. So you're right, something has to collapse. Well, it did once. Then generative AI caused it to recover. Now, over these last few years, though, there are a lot of VCs and founders saying, there's going to be a great model collapse. What do they call it? What do you call it when all the species die?
Extinction?
Extinction, yeah. There's going to be a mass extinction. And it's been going on. I mean, outside of AI, a lot of the AI companies, a lot of the startups, they're going bankrupt. I monitor them, those names. There aren't good numbers, so we don't see those. And there used to be, but a lot of these companies don't release that data anymore. So they're slowly going bankrupt. But now there's these AI companies. So you say, well, once the generative AI bubble pops, then all these companies will go bankrupt. Well, perhaps, but there may be a new set of companies. The scariest information I've seen recently is that the amount of money that investors are giving to VCs has actually gone up in 2025. So it had gone down in 2023, 2024, Now it's gone up. So now they have more money. So it's very hard to say what's going to happen. As long as interest rates are so low, uh, I guess it could go on for a long time. And there's a lot of friends to the startup system in governments. The Silicon Valley Bank collapsed. The government bailed out all these startups. So it may bail out these startups. I mean, you have the UK government that has basically said, we're not going to protect creative people, creative industries, books and movies, etc. And we're not going to protect them from generative AI. So generative AI trained on their data, but that's fine because we think generative AI is more important in the creative industries. So generative AI has a lot of friends in high places. And we also saw that in the US and Stargate, right? People have forgotten about it, but there was right big hullabaloo over the amount of money these companies were going to put in. So it's hard to say what's going to happen. And Trump is very he's very emotional, and if he thinks something's important, he'll put all his energy behind it and throw a lot of money at it. So it's hard to say what's going to happen.
Right. In your book, Unicorns, Hype, and Bubbles, you say that, quote, a mobile phone executive from Sony once told me that the first people to make money on new technologies were always consultants. They take no risk, but make money giving advice, often with the intent of bringing their company more work, not helping the client succeed, under your quote. But then you also talk about, you basically say that someone told you that AZ16, I believe, or was it Andrew Horowitz, or Andreessen Horowitz, that their VC firm is essentially a media company. You then talk about all the academic papers that are put out and how a lot of these, they're putting out so much papers, and a lot of these results that they get, you cannot actually replicate. And there's a lot of retractions. I mean, was it like Sturgeon's law? Was it like 75% of academic papers are bullshit? I forget the exact number, but that's it's one of the laws out there. But ultimately, there's a lot of people that are profiting when the companies themselves don't actually profit. What is the actual reason why we have all this hype? Is it just like, are we living in a grifter economy? Like you're mentioning before, like Robert Gordon is saying, we don't actually have an increase of production. Yeah. So if we don't actually produce anything, let's just like move money around, hype shit up. And is that what we're dealing with right now?
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. It's as I talked about earlier, this whole startup system has changed. It used to be that startups, money was very carefully put into startups, and they tried to come up with a good product that users wanted. They come up with revenues, they came up with profits, then they went public. They don't do that. They tell a big story, and for some reason, investors fall for it. Partly because it's easier to hype a company now than it was 25 years ago, 30 years ago. Before the internet, you needed to convince one of the big three television stations, ABC, CBS, or NBC, to air your news, or one of the big three magazines, Time, Newsweek, or U.S. News and World Report, or one of the big newspapers, like New York Times, Wall Street Journal. And those companies were very careful because they were concerned with their reputation. Reputation was everything. Well, that's all changed. You don't need them anymore, right? And people make fun of them anymore. Oh, old media. Oh, yeah, they're too conservative. So now you just publish it on your website. You hype it up on social media. You may even publish it with the old media if you pay them money, because a lot of this old media doesn't have subscribers to survive. So they take money from companies to publish an article. So it's very easy to publish things that really shouldn't be published. And then you pay people to post your stuff and like it. I've been offered money. I've never taken it, but I've been offered money to post stuff. It's been very annoying to me. I had one company, Chinese company, say, well, I'll give you $5,000 to come for a couple of days at this conference. Come to this conference and give a speech on this. Oh, and do 2 posts on the side. And then they tell me, well, we don't need the presentation. Just do the posts. So there's all this money floating around. right? When you have these big valuations of private held startups, and these big share prices, there's money to be given out for marketing, to pay people to write articles, to pay people to post articles, to pay people to like articles. It's very hard to get good information unless you work hard, right? You really have to have some critical thinking, and students don't have that anymore, right? Even policymakers don't. So it's kind of gone away. And this hype, it's not just about the tech sector, it's about everything, right? The political parties in America have such simple solutions, and Trump is not the first, right? All this goes way back. It goes back, 10, 15 years. A lot of simplicity out there, a lot of hype. So I don't think it's going to end. Maybe if there's a big bubble pop, some people will rethink things, but some people won't. Some people will just go right on thinking superficially about things. And, I guess that's their right.
So, Jeff, let's just say hypothetically that you had a child that was a senior in high school and was looking at, universities, what majors they should do, or maybe not even universities, maybe some type of blue collar job, being a plumber, electrician. You're in Singapore. Just assume, let's just, for this hypothetical, put you in U.S., Canada, England, something like that. What would your advice be? Is there majors that you'd want to steer this child toward or away from? Or is there hey, just don't go to university at all? What's in I did one of the things that you basically said was you think a lot of professors, academics hype this stuff up because they want to scare kids into all these jobs are going to be automated, go to school, continue the Ponzi scheme so I can keep my tenured job and teach my one class a week. You don't want to give that up, right?
Well, funny thing is, I have a 12-year-old son, so I'm faced with that all the time. And so, I try to get him to learn on his own, do well in school, but learn on his own, get hobbies that he likes and that can be potentially beneficial. So sports, math, some of it he does well, but it's a challenge because he, like all these other kids, is really pushed towards, games and things. And I try to push him away from that. And it's a big challenge. He's, and so, where do I try to push him to? Well, he's done some coding in the past, math, coding, these types of things. So, even AI. But when you say AI, what's the precursors to AI? Well, you got to do math, you got to do statistics, you got to do probability. You have to do all these things. So I'm pushing him partly towards that. I also am probably more optimistic about gene editing and things like that. I mean, I mentioned synthetic biology in the book, but in general, it's hard to say if we're doing worse at biotech startups or much worse than we used to, because biotech startups have always had this small chance of success. So, when you're dealing with the chances of success for a very rare event, it's very hard to show that it's actually getting rarer. So I try to get him interested in that too, but it's a big challenge because he's only 12, and I'm mostly concerned with him finding something he likes, right? In the end, as you've said it, life is about, you got to enjoy it. You gotta like to do what you're doing. You gotta like your job. You gotta like your hobbies. And so that's my biggest concern. Now, of course, I'm always trying to push him towards things that could make him money, right? And so I tell him this all the time, that you can make money doing this and that. Like, he really likes manga. He reads a lot of manga. Well, I'm glad he's reading, because you need to read, and most kids don't read today, and even kids in Singapore don't read. They just take exams, right? They don't really have. And if you read a lot of these Japanese manga kind of have complex plots. So if you're dealing with complexity, you're going to be able to deal with the world. But it's a challenge. This is something, a challenge that every parent goes through. It's a lot of work trying to encourage them to find things they like to do that will give them a job in the future.
Back in the day, it was like, oh, just like get a degree and that's enough. But now so many people have college degrees that the actual major that you have is more important. And not to mention the cost of university is just so expensive. I mean, you get a degree in, I don't know, like art history of the Mohican era of whatever. I mean, like, all these bullshit degrees. But yeah, when that degree was like $1,000, I mean, you could work at some coffee shop and pay it off. Now, when you get $80,000 and you're like, it actually does mean something because you have to pay off that, that loan. And college debt, unlike other debt, you can't bankrupt it away. Back in, I don't know, was it before the great financial crash of like 2007, you could actually bankrupt college debt away. You'd have doctors that would pull out, $150,000 in debt, graduate school, file a bankruptcy to get a job, and then 3 years later buy a house. So like, I mean, those days are done. I mean, you're stuck with this. You could be retired, and they're taking money out of your social security check because you got some art history major of the 13th century that you probably don't even know what it is anymore. But like, I mean, like you have to have maybe some more specifics, like what majors. There has to be majors that you're like, just don't do this. Like, I mean, like everyone's like, oh, AI. I hear people talk about like prompt engineering. I mean, isn't prompt engineering like you're just like put this into Google, but it's not Google. It's now into chat. Like, I'm not sure how advanced that is. Like, I don't know if that's going to get you anywhere.
Well, I certainly think there are degrees that are better than others. So science and engineering are better. But then there's the cost, right? And so I'm not sure that it's worth going to Harvard and any of these schools where you have to pay so much money. If you have a lot of money, right, it's not a big deal. If you're very rich, if you're in the top 1% in terms of income, well, then maybe it's okay. Maybe you push your kids for that. But if you're not, if you're only in the top 10%, then maybe you say, well, okay, you don't need to go to one of those universities. And Singapore is very expensive. The funny thing is that when it rarely gets mentioned in the U.S. press is that, medical care, our health care, education are very cheap, except in the U.S. That's why a lot of times it's almost free for these schools because it's very cheap. They don't have professors, only teaching one class a year. They don't have all these administrators and all these facilities and these sports teams to support. They don't have all that. They have a better emphasis on education. So in a lot of countries, education is cheap. Education is not very expensive in Singapore. I mean, it's $10,000 a year, and that's Singapore dollars, about 7,000 US dollars a year. That's nothing by US terms. And healthcare is the same way. It's not very expensive outside of the US. And yet longevity, people live longer in the European countries and other leading Asian countries. So yeah, what are you going to encourage your kid to do? Well, it's a different story outside the US because you're right that it's really not worth it to send kids to these top schools, spend 50,000 US dollars a year to go to one of these schools.
Right. And also, like in Europe, they don't have 645-foot lazy river with a slide like they do at the Texas Tech University. Let your tuition money pay for that lazy river. So, I mean, I'm sure you're out there with you're probably taking your virtual class on your iPad, from the lazy river, really getting educated, getting lots of getting very smarter. I mean, I'm not even sure what the word is.
No, you're right. All these facilities that companies universities have spent on, their whole goal was to get students to come to their university, and they didn't really care whether they educated the students. And now, what are we going to do about this? Right now, we got AI, and they're going to use AI to teach, and the students are going to use the AI to write homework. It gets worse, right? And how many people are really thinking carefully in America about how to revise this, how to fix this? Not very many people. So it's very sad.
Well, you're talking about in your book, you mentioned technology disrupting industries, and then you talk about the education industry. But it's like it doesn't matter if you can have the best course ever where some student learns so much information, but if they're not getting a credential, well, they don't care because no one's going to. Well, I shouldn't say no one, but few students are going to university to learn. They're going there to get the degree, the credential. But then also it's the flip side. Like the professor is there for a paycheck. I mean, like they're not there to like teach students. I was reading articles about how some students were upset because they were finding their homework graded and there was chat GBT prompts on the work that was sent to them. So the teacher's also using chat GPT. The teacher's probably loving it. Like, oh yeah, like I graded 400 papers today in 12 minutes. Great day. Like I really just maximize my holiday time now, because chat GPT is doing all the grading.
Yeah, you're right. It's a big problem. It's getting worse, and what are we going to do about it? I fall. I mean, I was an academic for years, and I still get this Chronicle of Higher Education. I get the mail about it. They're kind of dealing with, but not really. 10 years ago, there was a whole bunch of books about how we need to fix education, and we were going to. What was a MOOC? Multiple online courses, something like that. All that fell by the way. It said that wasn't going to work. But the interest in reforming education just went away. And now here we are again, encountering even bigger problems. It's getting worse. And yet how many people are going to reform it? Well, probably not many. I mean, fundamentally, if you want to educate yourself, you're going to have to do it yourself, right? And this is where I'm very jealous. I mean, I tell my son, of course, he doesn't appreciate it, but I tell him, man, when I was a kid, all I wanted to do was read books, but I couldn't get all the books I want because, my mother would take me to the library, but not very often. Libraries weren't that good. Now you can get anything. Look at all these YouTube videos. He watches some of them, history and stuff and science, but he also watches a bunch of junk. And so I'm very jealous. I'm like, there's so much to learn and it's right there at your fingertips. So for kids who are very motivated, there's so much for them. They can learn so fast.
Since we've talked about this tech sector and we were talking about your book, Unicorns, Hype, and Bubbles, if you're an investor, I mean, what are the asset classes that you should look at, or what are sectors that you should look at to actually think that in 10 years from now, they're going to grow and have potential?
Yeah, that's a very hard question. I mean, we don't see the improvements in technology, the rapid improvements that we need for these new technologies to become feasible. And so I'm very pessimistic. I mean, I look at what's happening and say, well, I'd be very careful about investing in these things. All of the valuations, all of the share prices are way, 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 way too high. And, maybe Warren Buffett was right. I mean, Warren Buffett never invested in these types of things. He invested in old line companies that had somehow, improved their operations or looked like they were improved. And so maybe there's something to learn from Warren Buffett. Maybe his message is even more important now than it was 10, 20 years ago.
It's interesting because right now you live in Singapore. You taught as a professor in Singapore, but you also taught in Japan. And so one of the things that I've done a lot of podcasts on is I've done numerous podcasts on kind of like the declining fertility rate. You actually mentioned Professor Charles Goodhart in your book, who of course came on to our podcast. And we had the privilege of discussing this topic with Professor Charles Goodhart. But how is like Japan? Japan and Singapore have some of the lowest fertility rates in the world, and Japan is very technologically advanced. Or I should say, in relation to a lot of other countries. But if every country in the world is kind of having like a shrinking population, it's really hard to kind of like outsource labor to other countries if they're having also labor shortages. The technological advancements aren't as progressing along as fast as we're discussing. So, like, what do you have to say about like fertility and with some of your experience in Japan and Singapore?
Yeah. It's funny how the AI people tell we should be concerned about everybody being unemployed, and then here now we're talking about how well maybe uh, there's there isn't enough people. There isn't enough people working, right? Isn't or trying to work, or we don't have enough revenues. It's a problem, and in the short term, it's going to cause problems. I mean, the biggest impact in Japan, and it's occurred in China and several other countries, has been the declining housing prices. There's so many houses in Japan that are empty. There's certain cities that are just ghost towns, boarded up houses. I don't know so much about Tokyo, but Nagasaki and places like this. And in China, the same thing, right? The property sector collapsed. You can't convince a Singaporean, though, the property sector is going to collapse. The only thing that's holding it up is all the foreigners investing there. But of course, they're investing there based on they think that housing prices are going to stay high. So if suddenly they think differently, then they'll collapse. So this is a short-term problem because in the long term, uh, low housing prices are good for people, right? All the people that can't buy a house can buy a house. So if the number of people declines, okay, we get less revenue, so there's government problems. But then there's cheaper housing, it's more space. So there's potentially a lot of benefits. During in Europe in the Middle Ages, they had all these pandemics, Black Death, and so on that killed a lot of people, which is of course very horrible. But then it opened up a lot of land to people and made their lives better. So there'll be winners and losers on this, and I don't want to say I hope that housing prices collapse and people lose all their wealth, but there will be a recovery. It's just that it'll be some pain for a while.
If you have a bunch of old, a huge percentage of the population that's elderly, like right now in the US, basically 20% is 65 or older.
Yeah.
So as you have less kids, which means that a lot of the younger people will have to work, and whether it's like nursing or working at kind of like elderly care facilities, things like that. So you actually have less people, and then you just have people taking care of infrastructure as people are moving out of cities. You're having to take care of power lines and and plumbing and sewer systems. So you actually have less people inventing stuff. So then like the technologically advancements that we think we'll have, well, all of a sudden now you have less resources put into that because you're putting them into the elderly. So it seems like the progress that we have now, like, hell, we might be at like peak innovation right now, maybe. I mean, is that what we're at? Are we at peak innovation in 2025?
Well, we could be, because the fertility is a problem. I think though that there will be opportunities because we really need lower housing prices. A lot of the housing prices are held up by zoning laws. You aren't allowed to build up and things. And there's a lot of people that support that because they don't want their housing prices to drop, right? The value of their houses to drop. So, it's a problem, and I don't really see a good solution to that. I mean, I shouldn't say because I don't see a good discussion emerging on that. We see a lot of crazy discussions, particularly in the Trump administration, about J.D. Vance gets mad because why don't more women get married? Well, that's their choice, and women don't have to get married like they did 50 years ago, 100 years ago, hundreds of years ago, right? They had to get married to be supported. Now they can do a job just as well as a man, so they don't need the man. Then a lot of women have lower sex drives than men, so they have a less interest in getting married than men. So there's a lot of unhappy men. It's not an easy it's not an easy problem to solve.
What are some of the most ridiculous kind of technology hype stories that you hear? I mean, I've read articles that are like, oh, like, you know, we're gonna have AI girlfriends and or AI boyfriends the next handful of years. No one's going to be in real relationships. Talking about how AI is going to be taking over pretty much every job. Like, you're not going to have a lawyer or a coder or an accountant. I mean, what are some of the like, the absolute like least realistic of these AI hypes that you hear?
Well, it's very sad that people talk about AI girlfriends, and you could think about robotic girlfriends and stuff, because you know it's it's kind of becoming popular because there's so many lonely people. So the AI industry wants to say, well, look at how great we are. We're disrupting this, we're disrupting that. This isn't really good. And it gets back to what you mentioned earlier, is that we want to be talking about how to make a happier society, a better society, happier people. And if we're not doing that with all this technology, we're not doing it the right way. So there are these problems there, and so actually, AI chatbots for people, for lonely people, I find it terrible that lonely people are going to depend on them, but they may succeed. You know, I think though that a lot of these kind of consumer AI for writing your homework and stuff, a lot of this stuff may succeed. I don't. Once the AI companies raise the prices, though, I'm not sure how well it will succeed. But there certainly is a demand for there. I think it's an easier problem to solve than trying to make companies more productive. That's where we hope that AI would help. So if AI can make companies more productive, then maybe they could pay people more, right? That's what's happened for much of human history, uh, and but it's not happening. Instead, it is some of these consumer applications. But as for the worst one, I mentioned it earlier about the self-replicating spaceships. So people like Sam Altman, they're always saying something really crazy about AGI and things, and it's unfortunate, that we listen so much, and U.S. Congress listens to such people who have such crazy things to say.
In the book, one of your kind of themes is like some of these technologies actually create more problems than solutions. You probably could look at something like social media, and I mean, is social media since its inception to now actually a net positive, a net negative, or neutral? I mean, you probably could make a case it's kind of a net negative. And then you start talking about like Chat GPT and DeepSeek, whatever, some of these other AIs. Do you really want a workforce that say graduated from college and they use chat gpt for everything? So now all of a sudden they're on their own. Their chat gpt is not going to actually be able to do it for them because they actually have these like real world problems that come up in real time that no one's had to deal with, or at least not Chat GPT. So are we going to be in like 15 years from now where all these people are talking about like the loneliness epidemic, which is from social media? Like, because instead of actually like getting a life and having real friends, they decide to spend it virtually. Like, are we going to have in 15 years like no one has job skills because they never learned them, and then they just had Chat GPT try to do everything, and our productivity is going to actually be like negative? Are we going to have like a negative growth GDP model for the first time in like centuries because of this?
Well, I think that skills have gone down over the last 20 years, and people ignore that because they think that we're all getting more people are getting college degrees. But the recent decline in college enrollment is partly because of the high cost of college, but it's also because it's not that great. It doesn't help you that much. So we are seeing a skills reduction in skills. And you very well could be right that ChatGPT is going to cause a further reduction in skills. And um, I just think it's the worst thing that kids can do is to use ChatGPT. I think the best application of ChatGPT is still companies train some ChatGPT AI model on their internal company data and use that to improve processes. All these consumer applications, they're going to succeed, and they're kind of the easy way for people like Sam Altman, but they're not going to help kids. They're not going to help kids, and a lot of parents are too busy to notice what's happening. And educators are just going to go along. Educators have been very slow at noticing any problem because they're making a lot of money. The top ones are. Uh, so I don't think they're going to solve the problem.
I always find it interesting because like I have a master's degree, so like if people find that out, they're like, oh, like I didn't realize like you were so smart. So it's like, oh, like I was an idiot 5 minutes ago, but then because I have a master's degree, now all of a sudden I'm smart. But like in 1939, the average college student had an IQ of 119. Now it's like closer to 102, which is barely average. So you essentially have a bunch of people with just like average IQs graduating. These people aren't like they're not Benjamin Franklin or Thomas Edison or like Tesla, Nikola Tesla, whatever. Just because you're graduating and writing a bunch of crappy academic papers doesn't mean we're not moving towards any like goal or.
Yeah, you raise a very good point. Education was designed in the late 19th century to augment all of the things that kids were learning in their day-to-day life. What were they learning? They lived on a farm. They helped their father and their mother, right? Farming. They helped their mother to cook. Cooking is chemistry. Cooking used to be a very involved process. I mean, you learned a lot from cooking, all about boiling stuff and temperatures and freezing stuff and preserving food. Kids learned that. And of course, once we got up at the farms, we stopped learning it. But a lot of kids, myself included, learned to fix things because our fathers fix things. We also learned to help our mothers. And so even 50 years ago, my mother cooked from scratch 60 years ago. But, it doesn't happen anymore. But education hasn't changed. There is no context for the education. So whereas, 50 to 150 years ago and before, all education was within a context. The context was you worked for your parents did some kind of job, you learned the job, or there was farming or something else. And the education helped you learn to read. So maybe you could learn some of those things faster. Maybe you could do some math, which you had to use in your negotiations and in buying and selling stuff. There was that context. There is no context anymore for education. It's all just some theory. And these teachers don't understand the context because they don't know anything about the jobs out there. And so it's very sad. We need to reintroduce that context. We need to introduce context. When you teach things to kids, you need to have a context. And I want to cite an example from ChatGPT. A professor had asked the student to give the 3 pillars of leadership. It was an organizational class. And I said, this is a lousy question. Don't ask a theoretical question. Don't ask a student to repeat theory. Students don't need to know theory to do jobs out there. They need to do something in the real world. So if you're going to ask a question about leadership, then you're going to ask about which people do you think represent great leadership or did great leadership. You find the people, you tell the story. You can tell the story with the theory, but it's got to be real world oriented. And preferably, you talk about someone now. You talk about somebody now who you think exhibits leadership, whether it's Sam, particularly somebody famous who gets in the news a lot. So Sam Altman or Elon Musk or, something like that, or it could be a politician, could be a singer, but make the question real world. Don't ask about theory because they don't need to know theory to do the real world. They need to understand how to apply that theory to the real world. And so the teachers ask the wrong questions. They ask the wrong questions because they don't know the right questions. All they know is theory because they read those academic articles and that's all they know. They don't know what anybody does in a company.
One area I've always kind of been interested in is flying, like commercial aviation, right? And it seems like in my lifetime, I mean, I'm 43 now, but flying has kind of progressively gotten worse, especially after the Patriot Act and was that 2001, whatever, after 9/11. But I was reading this academic article, which is called "An Examination of High-Speed Aircraft," and it basically said that if the pace of previous technological development was kept, a Mach 2.12 airliner would be the current norm. And this article's from 2024, and of course we had the Concorde, which operated in the 1970s and until 2003. Like, there's a lot of things that are actually like worse now. I mean, you talk to anyone that flew like in the 80s or 90s. I mean, you had like, you know, your first class stack was like a separate area. You were smoking on airplanes. Not that I'd want that, but it's like just kind of like the freedom that you actually had to just like sit there with ashtrays and whatnot. Like, now it's like you got like a 9-pound backpack and you're getting like hassled by the you know, like the person at the gate, like, oh no, the plane's not weighted for that, whatever.
Yeah.
But I think
Well,
like
it depends on the
go ahead.
It depends on the metric you look at, right? So the price metric is flying has certainly gotten cheaper. But you're right. If you look at the time spent, all right, you have to get there so much earlier. You have to stand in all these lines. It's a lot of work, particularly in America. I'll tell you, airports outside of America are a lot better, a lot better. But it depends on the metric.
Well, you're also talking like in the U.S. I mean, they had was a deregulation in the 1978, so you just never had any competition. I mean, I think the high prices you're talking about was more regulation than actually due to the airlines competing because they couldn't.
Yeah. No, you're right.
We're not actually innovating. So then if you're not actually creating anything, then you're just kind of like like I always say, like basically like in the US, we used to be a bunch of engineers. If you used to look at like Congress 50 years ago, like 75% of people in Congress were an engineer. And we were building all these dams and all these big infrastructure products. Now you look at most members of Congress, they're actually from like the financial sector. And so now we have financial engineering. So instead of engineering projects, we're engineering finance, which is like the whole reason we had the 2008 housing crash. So is it just like the only way to make money now is to actually be a scammer?
Well, there is a big trend towards that. There is a big trend towards that. You know, a lot of the problem is that there isn't the level of innovation to support the strategy of getting rich through innovation. There just isn't enough. And so what do you do when you can't? I think a lot of people, a lot of innovators, they start off wanting to innovate, but then they realize they can't really make money doing that way. So who was the woman who got convicted, the Theranos CEO founder? Elizabeth Holmes. I don't think she started off wanting to, do illegal things. I think that she started off thinking that this was possible. It wasn't possible. But as it became clear to her it wasn't possible, she started to cut corners. I think there's lots of people out there this way. They don't start off as bad people, but they start to cut corners because they don't want to lose money. They don't want to admit they were wrong. And we have all these Forbes 30 over 30 or 30 under 30 right there. They've been convicted of crimes, and it's become a more common way to make money.
So today's guest has been Dr. Jeffrey Funk, who is a technology consultant, engineer, and retired professor. And today we discussed his latest book, which is called Unicorns, Hype, and Bubbles, A Guide to Spotting, Avoiding, and Exploiting Investment Bubbles in Tech. Jeff, just let us know where people can get a hold of your book, that kind of information. And then secondly, leave us with a final thought related to this podcast or whatever is on your mind.
Well, the book is available on Amazon or any bookseller. It's published by Harriman House. You can also follow me on LinkedIn. I post almost every day, usually on stuff related to AI, because that's the big hype right now. And they're pretty easy to find on LinkedIn.
And what's the final thought that you have related to this podcast?
Well, I hope that my thoughts don't cause you to give up on finding better ideas. I hope that I've encouraged you to look deeper, because a lot of the problem is that people aren't looking deeper. People are accepting. People hear things by these tech bros and think, oh, there's the answer. Well, I hope that you look deeper and do deeper analysis to find some good opportunities out there.
My dear friends, that is it for this episode of El Podcast. Once again, if you're not yet subscribed, please subscribe on YouTube as well as Rumble. You can also find us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts from. We thank you all from the bottom of our hearts for watching and listening, and we will see you on the next episode.